Welcome to this session of Cornell Notes. Our topic is plot. The two essential questions that we're going to be dealing with are first, how does the plot and the conflict work together to tell a story? And second, what makes a plot effective? Now, we may not necessarily be answering these questions in this video, but I want you to be thinking about these questions and wrestling with them a little bit as you watch the video and as you continue to learn more about studies. Now, because this is a Cornell Notes lecture, be sure to have your Cornell Notes paper out and be taking notes as you listen to the video. You'll need to pause the video at certain times to take down the notes. I will also be giving you annotations that are just recommendations, not necessarily annotations that you need to do, just suggestions. And I'll also be providing some questions for your margins as well. So be looking for those as we go through the video. Alright, let's start with our first header. First header is plot. A plot is a series of events that make up a story. The plot of a story usually centers on the conflict or struggle faced by the main character. Most story plots have 5 stages: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. It's important that we understand each of these stages and what happens in them. Go ahead and pause the movie now and take down the note. A few annotations that I've added to this note can now be seen on your screen. First of all, I'm circling key words in each of the notes, so plot and conflict are 2 important words here. I'm underlining main ideas, so a plot is a series of events and there are 5 stages in it. I've numbered each of the 5 stages to help me remember the order. One question that you can write down to help you learn this material is, what is the sequence of the 5 stages in a plot? Now the sequence, of course, is the order. If you can answer this question, you're doing pretty well so far. Second question that you can ask yourself to help you study this note is, how does the plot relate to the conflict? Let's move on to our second note. The second header is exposition. The exposition occurs at the beginning of a story. During the exposition, the author usually provides important background information about the story's main characters, conflict, and setting. Now, it's very important that you guys remember each of those 3 things that are developed during this stage of the plot. So remember again, the 3 things that are developed during the exposition are the characters, the conflict, and the setting. A few annotations that I made are, first, I circled exposition as a key word, then I underlined some of the important ideas that you can find in this text. So first of all, the exposition occurs at the beginning of a story, and it gives important background information about the following 3 things: characters, conflict, and setting. Remember those 3 things. One question that you can ask yourself to help you study this note is, what 3 elements are usually developed during the exposition? Another question is, why is the exposition important? Our next header is rising action. The rising action is a stage of the plot that develops the conflict. During this stage, events occur that make the conflict more complicated. A few annotations are, first of all, just circling rising action, and then making sure to remember that the rising action is what develops the conflict, or that's when that happens. One question that will help us to remember what's important about the rising action is, what happens during the rising action? Let's move on to our next one. The header is climax. The climax is the point of greatest interest in a story and usually occurs toward the story's end. This is often the point at which the protagonist is furthest from achieving his or her goal. Now remember that. Sometimes we think of the climax as a point in the story when the protagonist starts to resolve the conflict, but that doesn't happen yet. It happens in the next stage. So the climax is where the readers are all wondering if the protagonist is going to be able to resolve the concern. So it's the point of greatest tension in the story. A few annotations you can make on this note are, again, circling the key word and then underlining some of the main ideas here. One question that can help you to study climax is, identify the climax either of a book you recently read or of a movie you recently watched. If you can do that, then you have a good understanding of the climax. The next header you should write down is falling action. The falling action is the stage of the plot in which the protagonist begins to resolve his or her main conflict. The tension felt during the climax begins to ease. So this is when the protagonist starts to resolve the conflict. A few annotations you can make are now on the screen. A question you can ask yourself is, what occurs during the falling action of a story? The next header is resolution. This is the final stage of the plot. The resolution is the stage of the plot in which the conflict is fully resolved. Often we find out what the protagonist has learned and felt as a result of going through the conflict. So this is where the reader can reflect and often find the message, the theme, or anything else that we could have learned by watching the character develop as he or she worked to overcome the conflict. Annotations you can make are now on the screen. And a question you can ask is, what do we typically find out during the resolution? The next header is plot variation. A plot variation is a twist on the traditional pattern of plot. There are three main variations that authors use in their stories. Now, we're going to go over these plot variations, and hopefully this will give us a little bit more in-depth understanding of how authors sometimes approach a story. They don't always have to follow the 5 stages of plot in that order. Sometimes they make some changes to make the story more interesting. These are some annotations that I made. And a question is, what are the 3 main variations on the traditional plot structure used by most authors? Let's check out the first one on the next slide. The first variation on plot is in medias res. This is a Latin phrase that means in the midst of things. Authors using this technique usually begin their stories in the center of the action, often near the climax. They may provide information about the beginning of the story through flashbacks. A few annotations circling in medias res. And remember that if a story starts in medias res, it usually begins near the climax, and then the author goes back in time using flashbacks to show the reader how the protagonist has gone through the story and the conflict to reach the climax where the story began. One question you can ask yourself is, what does the Latin phrase in medias res mean? Another question is, where does a story begin when the author uses the in medias res variation? A second variation on plot is a flashback, and this is closely connected usually to in medias res. A flashback is a jump back in time that authors use to provide additional information to the reader. Flashbacks may go back to a time before the story started or to an earlier time within the story's narrative. These are a few annotations that you can make. It's important to realize what we mean when we talk about the 2 different times to which a flashback can go. So a flashback may go back to a time before the story started. Maybe a flashback could be told in which the character's father was going to college. And maybe the story started with our protagonist, the father's son, beginning college himself. So we're going back in time before the first chapter of our story to see what happened before the story began. The other place that you can go to in time for a flashback is at an earlier time within the story's narrative. This might happen when an author wants to help the reader remember something that happened earlier in the story. One question you can ask yourself is, why do authors use flashbacks? Another question is, what are the 2 times relative to the narrative from which a flashback can provide additional information? The third variation on plot is a cliffhanger. A cliffhanger occurs either when the author ends the story at its climax or when the author introduces a new conflict after the resolution. A few annotations are now on the screen. A question you can ask yourself is, what are the 2 ways used by authors to create cliffhangers? The next header is subplot. A subplot is an additional or secondary plot in a story. Subplots contain their own conflict, which is usually separate from but related to the main conflict of the story. So this happens, for example, in most movies that we watch, and in most books that we read. There's usually not just one main conflict that's happening in the story, but rather there's usually several conflicts going on at the same time. But the sub-conflicts, or the subplots, usually revolve around the main conflict of the story. These are a few annotations that you can make. And a question you can ask is, how does a subplot relate to the main plot of a story? That concludes our Cornell Notes session on plot. Thank you for watching.